It was July 9th before Admiral Nimitz received all the reports from his subordinate commanders. There is no record of his reaction. Meanwhile, however, the communications intelligence community expected the worst. Although the reports played down the possibility of leaks, it was apparent that there could be literally hundreds of Army Air Force, Navy, and Marine personnel in the South Pacific who had some knowledge, however slight or erroneous, of the Yamamoto shoot-down. Some were already returning to the States with tales of their experiences. Although the word spread that the mission was not to be discussed by anyone, too many officers and enlisted men never got the word, or were already transferred elsewhere, unaware of the damage their knowledge, no matter how meager, could do to American forces in the Pacific if revealed. Naval Communications security personnel were instructed to check all intercepted messages for any evidence that the Japanese realized their codes had been compromised. Military investigators and FBI personnel in the United States were instructed to scan American newspapers and magazines to see if any security leaks had developed. While the American investigation was going on, the Japanese people were devastated by the loss of their beloved naval leader. His death was a severe blow to national morale, a blow as cruel to their psyche as the Doolittle raid on Tokyo had been a year before. When the word flashed to the world that Yamamoto had died, Time magazine put its staff to work on a story about his demise. At least one Time magazine reporter was on Guadalcanal when the mission returned who wrote up a lot of information after talking to us, according to Doug Canning, one of the members of the top cover flight. The presence of a Time reporter on Guadalcanal was confirmed by Lieutenant Commander Reed, Mitch's administrative officer, in Reed's oral history statement. Stateside Time reporters checked out the rumors about the shoot-down that persisted in Washington and elsewhere to verify the report from the correspondent in the South Pacific. The May 31st, 1943, issue of Time displayed a caricature of Yamamoto and reported his death. The story inside, on page 28, said that a meeting of the Imperial Rule Assistance Association in Tokyo had adopted a resolution. We, the 100 million people of Japan, have simultaneously expressed our deepest condolence, and we are burning with a greater spirit to fight against our enemy, America and Britain. Let us march in line in one united body, so that the spirit of the late Fleet Admiral may be kept alive. Rear Admiral Hideo Yano, chief of the Japanese Navy's press section, was quoted, "The Japanese Navy will stride forward with the profound will to destroy the enemy. The war is to be prolonged, and I, with you, to make the spirit of the Fleet Admiral live, must preserve and fulfill his will." The magazine ended the story with these words: "When the name of the man who terminated Admiral Yamamoto is released, the US will have a new hero," said one veteran of Pacific service. "The only better news would be a bullet through Hitler." It can be assumed that Times reporters knew who the hero was and the details of the mission. On page 66 of the same issue, there was a large photo of Lanfier, captioned, "High Man in a Brother Act." Under the title Heroes was this story: Area. To military theorists, the South Pacific was still a static battle. But in the day-to-day run of patrols and minor battles, new heroes were born, new air tactics proved by flyers grown skillful and canny in the school of war. Out from a Solomon's base streaked 16 twin-tailed Army Lightning fighters, feathering their own wind-blown wakes as they hugged the water to stay out of the beams of Japanese radio detectors. Near the enemy base at Kahili, 12 of the pilots horsed back on their wheels, ripped skyward with whining turbo superchargers to give top cover. The 4 near the water bored on, found unexpected game. 3 Japanese bombers waddling home with a heavy cover of Zeros. The bombers lurched frantically for the cover of their own anti-aircraft. The Zeros piled into the Lightnings and both top covers swirled in a thundering dogfight. Down below, Lieutenant Rex T. Barber whipped into a bomber, sawed off its tail with a burst of fire, knocked off a second as he pulled out of the attack. The squadron commander, lean, black-eyed Captain Thomas G. Lanfier, tangled with a low-flying Zero, shot it down. He swung away, picked a bomber, shot it down too. Up above, the top cover fight had broken off. A mission had been completed. The squadron whisked back to the Solomon's base, wondered if it had nailed some Japanese bigwig in the bombers. The article noted that Lanfier's younger brother Charles, Marine pilot, had recently arrived in the Solomons and had participated in a battle over Russell Island flying a Vought Corsair At the same time, his brother Tom was engaged in a dogfight at a higher altitude in a P-38. The coincidence made that day's combat reports remarkably fine reading for their father, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas G. Lanfier, Sr., a West Pointer who won his pilot's wings in World War I, later resigned to survey commercial air routes and is now on duty again with the General Staff in Washington. To the casual reader, the two items in the same issue of Time would seem unrelated, but in light of subsequent revelations about the Yamamoto shootdown, it is obvious that Time reporters had learned the details from a knowledgeable source. There was great apprehension within the intelligence community that the extensive code-breaking capability of the Americans would at last become known to the Japanese. Apparently, that issue of Time did not reach the enemy's intelligence experts. If it did, they did not tie the two news items together. Besides, their code experts still believed their code was unbreakable. Before Mitchell left the South Pacific, Lieutenant General Millard F. Harmon asked him to hand-carry a personal letter to Lieutenant General H. H. Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. On Noumea, Admiral Halsey had asked General Harmon to let the Navy make presentations of medals, and Harmon had agreed. When he gave Mitchell the letter, Harmon told him that if Halsey didn't give Mitchell the Medal of Honor for his outstanding leadership, he would. This conversation took place after General Harmon had reprimanded Mitchell and several of his pilots verbally, as he had stated in his letter to Nimitz. The letter Mitchell carried to Arnold explained his role in planning and leading the mission. Since Harmon had agreed that the Navy should make the awards to Mitchell and his men, it was Harmon's way of assuring that the top-ranking general of their own service would know how Harmon personally felt about Mitchell's planning and leadership ability. It was also to assure that future Air Force historians would know who deserved recognition for the mission's success, in case the Navy downplayed its significance, or chose not to acknowledge that the participants were Army Air Force pilots. Harmon's letter noted that this was a beautifully conceived mission and executed from start to finish with high determination and consummate skill. All the officers participating are to be highly commended, and for this action the Navy requested, and we acceded to their request to bestow decorations upon them. The Navy's insistence on secrecy in connection with this mission, I am sure you will appreciate, as public knowledge of all the facts involved would adversely affect the intelligence sources that made the accomplishment of this particular mission possible. Harmon also wrote a letter of commendation to Mitchell. There have been few, if any, missions in the history of our Air Force in which such outstanding victory has been achieved in the face of seemingly insuperable difficulties. You and your squadron have demonstrated that the combination of sound planning, a trained organization, superior equipment, and perfect execution under outstanding leadership can accomplish the impossible. The excellent results obtained in combat at extremely low altitudes, when enemy equipment enjoyed every advantage in performance and maneuverability, reflect the soundness of your fighting technique and the excellence of your indoctrination and air discipline. The splendid performance of equipment is a triumph for the officers and men of your organization, responsible for its maintenance and servicing, and we all pay tribute to their superior work. In a final paragraph, Harmon stated, "This letter is in no manner to be considered in lieu of any combat award, but rather as the expression of appreciation of the Army forces in the South Pacific by the commander thereof." On May 26, 1943, Mitchell, Lanfier, Barber, Canning, Girk, Holmes, and Jacobson received orders transferring them back to the States. Mitchell and Lanfier were ordered to Washington, where they were interrogated by Army and Navy intelligence and operations officers. They made many recommendations concerning fighter operations, which were published in the classified Army Air Force's Command Informational Intelligence Series. No mention was made of the Yamamoto shoot-down in the secret report disseminated to intelligence officers in the field. Always seeking to report good news, the War Department's Bureau of Public Relations issued a press release on June 17, 1943, quoting Mitchell and Lanfier's favorable opinions about the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and their experiences fighting in the South Pacific. Mitchell was credited with downing 8 Japanese planes, Lanfier with 7. There was no direct mention of the Yamamoto shoot-down. The release stated, Captain Lanfier brought down 2 Japanese bombers on April 18th while participating in a sweep led by Major Mitchell. While the Major climbed with 12 lightnings to furnish high cover, Captain Lanfier's flight of 4 started the attack and brought down a total of 6 enemy planes. The first fighter plane this fighter pilot shot down was while he was on an intelligence mission in a B-17 last August. 12 Zeros attacked the bomber and 3 other B-17s in the flight. Captain Lanfier seized a waist gun and knocked down one of the attackers. All of the Japanese planes were destroyed. Despite the concerns of the Naval Communications intelligence experts, this release, actually prepared by the Army Air Force's public information personnel, might also have given the Japanese a clue about how the Americans had learned of the Admiral's itinerary. Again, no evidence has ever been found that the Japanese had any inkling that Lanfier was the American hero who was believed to have caused the Admiral's demise, or that their naval code had been compromised. The official War Department news release also gave affirmation to Lanfier's claim that he had shot down a Zero while acting as a gunner on a bombing mission, thus crediting him with the first of 7 victories, even though no one witnessed this TDLT and no one on the B-17 crew ever confirmed Lanfier's victory. No other fighter pilots before or since were ever given credit for eliminations while acting as gunners on a bomber. But Lanfier was in Washington and had access to the War Department news release writers. The anonymous B-17 crew did not. The War Department release also stated, "Fighter pilots account as confirmed victories only those enemy planes which they see burn, explode, fall apart, crash, or from which the pilot bails out. No others are accredited victories, regardless of how many rounds a pilot may be sure he has pumped into the enemy plane or pilot. If the enemy is not visibly destroyed, he does not count on the record as a victory." Mitchell, Lanfier, Barber, and Holmes received their Navy Crosses in separate ceremonies at bases where they were later assigned. The citation for Lanfier reads, "For extraordinary heroism while attached to a Marine fighter command in action against enemy Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands on April 18, 1943, leading a division of fighter planes at dangerously low altitude in the longest planned interception mission ever attempted, Captain Lanfier contacted the assigned objective, consisting of 2 enemy bombers and 6 escort fighters, with complete tactical surprise, and launched a fierce, determined attack. In the ensuing engagement, he operated with such daring courage and excellent marksmanship that he sent the leading bomber crashing in flames and subsequently shot down one of the hostile fighters when it furiously attacked his plane." Barber's citation states, "Participating in a dangerously long interception flight, First Lieutenant Barber contacted a formation of 2 enemy bombers escorted by 6 fighters in a complete surprise approach. Quickly engaging the enemy, he pressed his tactical advantage and struck fiercely, destroying one Japanese bomber at such close range that fragments from the explosion lodged in the wings of his plane, and shooting down the escorting enemy fighter plane which had been attempting to divert the attack." Lanfier had told Barber that he had written these citations for the Medal of Honor and those for Mitchell, Holmes, and Hine, which Halsey had downgraded to the Navy Cross. The assignment to the Pentagon was to Lanfier's liking. His father had been assigned there when called to active duty as a lieutenant colonel after war had been declared. Both Lanfiers had ready access to public information personnel who were always on the lookout for good battle news, and heroes who could be exploited for public relations purposes. The elder Lanfier, extremely proud of his son, had known General Henry H. Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, and other generals since World War I days. He had easy access to his old friends now serving in high Air Force positions. A short time after arriving in Washington, the younger Lanfier and Mitchell were sent on a tour of Air Force basic flying training bases to talk with student pilots and reassure those who were apprehensive about volunteering to fly fighter planes. Lanfier buzzed the field with his lightning to proclaim his arrival, and was introduced to the instructors and students as a recently returned fighter ace. With his 50 Mission Crush cap pushed back on his head, he entertained the students with combat tales of the South Pacific. He was the embodiment of the devil-may-care fighter pilot whose self-confidence was exceeded only by his ability to colourfully describe aerial encounters with the enemy. The story submitted by J. Norman Lodge for security clearance, based largely on Lanfier's input, had eliminated any chance of Mitchell getting the Medal of Honor. "The Navy tracked me down when I got to Washington," Mitchell recalled. I was told that Admiral King wanted to see me. I went to King's office, but rather than see me, I was shunted off to some 3-star admiral. He told me King was disturbed about the leakage of information concerning the Yamamoto mission, and he asked me to fill him in on what I know about the security on Guadalcanal, or lack thereof. Figuring that they might be trying to make a scapegoat out of me, I told them I had plenty to say. I asked them to give me a secretary, and I would tell it all, the way I saw it. Alter some 2 hours of dictation, during which I told them of the lack of security on the island, that there were many people in the dugout at our briefing who had nothing to do with the mission, that the ground crews, having to hang the larger external tanks, knew it was a long mission, and when the mission was over there was much elation by the pilots, and that Lanfier stated loud and clear that he had shot down Admiral Yamamoto. That was the last I heard of anything about that matter. But when Lanfier and I went to Lockheed a couple of weeks later to pick up 2 P-38s to use to visit all of the basic flying schools in the US, we were treated with much deference and courtesy. I am convinced they had word on the Yamamoto mission, and had probably been informed by Lanfier because they all knew we had been awarded Navy Crosses. On August 28, 1943, Lieutenant Charles C. Lanfier, Tom Lanfier's younger brother, a Marine Corsair pilot, was shot down over Russell Island and was captured by the Japanese. He was imprisoned at Rabaul, New Britain. When the news was received in Washington, it gave the Navy another reason why no information about the Yamamoto shoot-down should be released. In Admiral Halsey's memoirs, explaining why he was so upset about the possible leak of the story to Lodge, the Associated Press reporter, he said he was also concerned for Lanfier's sake. His brother was a prisoner of war, and if the Japanese had learned who had shot down Yamamoto, what they might have done to the brother is something I prefer not to think about. Lieutenant Charles C. Lanfier passed away due to malnutrition on Rabaul, while a prisoner of war on April 29, 1944. His death was not known until after the Japanese surrender. The concern about the possibility of the Japanese discovering that their codes had been broken was widely felt. In January 1944, General MacArthur sent a classified letter to his commanders. Revelations of the Yamamoto incident by the returnees from the Pacific Theater are developing into a serious situation. It is directed that before they return to the United States, you order all those concerned under your command not to reveal such information to friends, relatives, or news media. Further revelation of information will ultimately lead to compromising the information source. With the continuing concern about the Japanese finding that their top-secret naval codes had been compromised, and Lanfier's brother's capture always in mind, the Air Force would not reassign Lanfier to the Pacific. Instead, he was assigned to the Pentagon and given some unspecified duties. In addition to his flights around the country, he made a trip to England and observed fighter operations there. He was promoted to major and later to lieutenant colonel just before the war ended in mid-1945. Lanfier had long before resolved he was going to write his version of the Yamamoto shoot-down and his exploits as a fighter pilot and have them cleared for release. He submitted 2 stories for security review in 1944. They were finally cleared for public consumption, along with a War Department news release on September 11, 1945. The bylined stories appeared in the New York Times, and a slightly different version, syndicated by the North American Newspaper Alliance, was widely published in other U.S. newspapers. Lanfier appeared to have won his objective to receive national acclaim for the most noted aerial ambush in history. The formal surrender of the Japanese took place on the deck of the USS Missouri, September 2, 1945. It was a welcome relief from the long months of tension. However, there were still serious concerns among members of the communications intelligence community about revealing any information concerning breaking the Japanese codes. James Forrestal, who had become Secretary of the Navy in May 1944, wrote in his diary about an interesting exchange of urgent top-secret messages that took place among the U.S. Navy codebreakers a few days after the surrender. In the enthusiasm of victory, someone let out the story of how in 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese naval commander-in-chief and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had been intercepted and shot down in flames as a result of the American ability to read the Japanese codes. It was the first public revelation of the work of the cryptoanalysis divisions, and it brought an anguished cable from the intelligence unit already engaged at Yokohama in the interrogation of Japanese naval officers. Yamamoto's story in this morning's paper has placed our activities in very difficult position. Having meticulously concealed our special knowledge, we now become ridiculous. They were even then questioning the Japanese officer who had been responsible for those codes, and he has been hinting that in the face of this disclosure, he would have to terminate himself. The cable continued. This officer is giving us valuable information on Japanese crypto systems and channels, and we do not want him or any other promising prospects to commit self-termination until after next week, when we expect to have milked them dry. Washington answered with an operational priority top-secret dispatch. Your lineal position on the list of those who are embarrassed by the Yamamoto story is 5,692. All of the people over whose deceased bodies the story was going to have been published have been buried. All possible schemes to localize the damage have been considered, but none appears workable. Suggest that only course for you is to deny knowledge of the story and say you do not understand how such fantastic tale could have been invented. This might keep your friend happy until self-termination time next week, which is about all that can be expected. Tom Lanphier and the other participants in the Yamamoto mission had been forbidden to tell their versions of the shoot-down publicly until after the war. Lanphier had actually written his account in 1944, but it was withheld on security grounds. When Lanphier's stories were published after the Japanese surrendered, and the War Department published a news release giving Lanphier full credit for Yamamoto's demise, the surviving pilots were astonished. Each wondered how Lanphier could claim credit so blatantly in syndicated stories that were published nationwide in hundreds of newspapers. The official reports of the mission claimed 3 Betty bombers and 3 Zeros had been shot down. All of the surviving members of the Yamamoto mission accepted those figures as fact. However, in 1945, it was not yet confirmed by the Japanese that Yamamoto was aboard the bomber that had gone down in the jungle, and no one had ascertained that there were only 2 Betty bombers instead of 3. No one but Japanese personnel and local natives had visited the wreckage during the war. No Japanese had yet published any eyewitness accounts of the events surrounding the mission. As soon as Rex Barber read Lanphier's account in a California newspaper, he telephoned Lanphier, still assigned to the Pentagon. Barber was then squadron commander of the 27th Fighter Squadron at Marchfield, California. In the presence of Colonel David Lee Tex Hill, famous Flying Tiger ace and Barber's group commander, Barber lambasted Lanphier for making a claim he knew was not true. Lanphier, taken aback by Barber's uncharacteristic fury, replied with a telegram. Lanphier implied that the story would be changed and you will be included in everything as you certainly deserve. He added, meanwhile say nothing, repeat nothing. After Barber's phone call, Lanphier also wrote Barber a letter. Enclosed is a copy of the story I sold the New York Times. It was released the day after the War Department put out its story. Also released at that time were stories on the same subject by J. Norman Lodge, who got his dope from Strother, by Bors, who got his story from Admiral Mitcher, and by Mahan, who got his story from Mitchell at Noumea. All of the stories mentioned all 3 of us, you, Mitch and me, equally. The story you read, which left you both out, must have been pretty short not to have included you. The War Department release, while mentioning everyone, gave me the best of it. Why, I don't know. They had all the facts at hand, Mahan's, Lodge's, Bors, and my stories all written at different times. They also had all the intelligence reports and citations for reference. They broke the story, apparently because the Navy did first. Also seems all Japanese prison camps have been taken over as well as their radio and press facilities. As you know, and as you will note, I mention in my story I am very much indebted to you, for my neck as well as other things. I don't know what I can do to remedy the situation, but I certainly am not happy that you felt you got shafted. I am stationed here in the Pentagon for a month or 2, as of today, and will be glad to do whatever I can. I talked to the Public Relations Office people this morning and asked them why they didn't reissue all the Navy Cross citations in an effort to further clarify the fact that credit is due a lot of people for that mission. They are going to. Would have thought they'd do that in the first place. Barber was furious at Lanfier's reaction to his phone call and tried to report his own version of the Yamamoto mission through official channels, rather than through the press as Lanfier had done. Unfortunately, no one in Barber's chain of command paid any attention to his request for a review of the mission. He never received replies to his letters. He enlisted the help of intelligence officers he knew and asked them to see what they could do to check the official classified records. One of those who tried to assist Barber in having his claim acknowledged about shooting the lead bomber down was Colonel Luther Kissick, then serving with Barber as an intelligence officer at Kuilin, China. "I was shocked at that time after talking with Barber," Kissick said, "that there was no intensive, detailed debriefing of this mission, as important as it was. The intelligence information on the location of the top Japanese leader was very precise and accurate. Where was the accurate intelligence follow-through on the mission flown to tidy up the operation?" Unfortunately, since the action had taken place in another theatre, Kissick was unable to help Barber tell his side of the story. The official report, which Lanfier had told Barber he had written, remained classified secret for many years. Barber was not able to see a copy for over a decade after the mission. Barber's claim rested on a single premise. If Yamamoto was in the lead bomber, Barber was certain he had shot it down. Lanfier had reported that the two Betty bombers had separated when he and Barber were trying to close in. "The Bettys definitely did not split at that time," Barber asserts. "They were still together and on their original course when I caught up with them, and after Lanfier had turned toward the Zeros. This is a key error in the official report. Had the lead bomber turned left when Lanfier said it had, it would have rammed right into the bomber dying on its left wing, because they were flying close together." In a history of the 13th Air Force, historians noted, "Both Lanfier and Barber destroyed a Betty which the Zeros tried desperately to protect, but Barber's Betty disintegrated at 5,000 to 6,000 feet. A subsequent report by the Japanese states that Yamamoto was found dead in the wrecked plane, which would indicate that he was a victim of Lanfier. The Japanese claimed likewise that he was shot down by 30 or 40 fighters." This information was based solely on an interview with Lanfier in Washington on September 10, 1945. John Mitchell, a colonel at the end of the war, was also furious at Lanfier's persistent and continuous play for the national limelight. Regarding the Nana story in which Lanfier said Mitchell had verified over the radio that he saw a bomber burning in the jungle, Mitchell states emphatically that, "I did not reply on the radio that I saw a bomber burning. In no way could I confirm that he had shot down a bomber. I saw smoke rising out of the jungle and nothing more from where I was at about 16,000 feet. Lanfier claimed from day one that he shot the admiral down and defied anyone to say he didn't." At the same time that Lanfier was getting extensive newspaper coverage through his stories, the Washington Post carried a gossip column by Leonard Lyons that gave further credibility to Lanfier's claim to fame. Lieutenant Colonel Tom Lanfier, Jr., the Army flyer who shot down the plane in which Admiral Yamamoto was a passenger, almost ran out of gas on his flight back to Guadalcanal. He thought he'd have to land on the Russell Islands, 50 miles away, but finally decided to go on. He radioed to the Guadalcanal airfield, asking that the field be cleared for his landing because he didn't have enough gas to circle it. Then he added the news that Yamamoto would be unable to dictate any peace in the White House. The puzzled radio operator at Guadalcanal asked him to explain, but Lanfier remained silent. But by the time the pilot landed, all personnel on Guadalcanal had heard the rumor that Yamamoto had joined his ancestors. Colonel Lanfier's commanding officer ordered him retired from combat flying for two reasons: the possibility that he would be shot down and captured, and perhaps tortured into revealing that the Americans had broken the Japanese code. Furthermore, Lanfier's brother was a prisoner of war. The colonel finally persuaded his commanding officer to allow him to visit England for 2 weeks, promising not to do any flying. Lanfier arrived in England with a bag in which there were only a toothbrush and 4 bottles of liquor. 1 bottle was for Ira Wolfert, the war correspondent. The other 3 were for bribing Thunderbolt and Lightning squadrons to allow him to fly. Colonel Lanfier flew in all those planes before he came home. When Lanfier received so much publicity after his stories were published nationwide, Mitchell decided that he would not stand by without objecting to Lanfier's blatant claim to fame. In a speech at a luncheon in San Antonio on January 8, 1946, Mitchell said that positive credit could not be given to Lanphier because no one knew at that time which bomber the Admiral was in. "I rather resent the credit being given to Captain Lanphier and the ignoring of Captain Barber. When details of the death of Yamamoto were finally announced, I felt that an injustice had been done to Captain Barber. I would simply like to put the record straight." Shortly thereafter, a story appeared in Army Times, a service newspaper, which Mitchell said contained the same old stuff about Lanphier getting the credit for not only the shoot-down, but planning and leading the mission. The article stated, "Another big triumph of the 13th Air Force occurred on April 18, 1943, when Lieutenant Colonel Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr., then a captain, intercepted and shot down the plane of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was credited by the Japanese with the boast that he would dictate peace terms from the White House. Acting on information relayed to commands in the Southwest Pacific by the Secretary of the Navy, Lanphier and a group of 13th Air Force flyers in P-38s departed Guadalcanal for their rendezvous with Yamamoto, who was accompanied by his entire high command. Admiral Yamamoto later was officially announced by the Japanese to have been terminated in combat with the enemy, and Colonel Lanphier was awarded the Navy Cross for the success of his mission. Mitchell was furious. Once more, Lanphier's story had been given credibility. One of the youngest colonels in the Air Force at the end of the war, Mitchell had served overseas 3 times during the war and had 11 enemy aircraft to his credit. He was flying missions over Japan when the war ended. When he read this article, he had had enough of Lanphier's continual demand for credit. A colonel stationed at Maxwell Field, Alabama at the time, he decided to write to General Carl Spaatz, commanding general of the Army Air Forces. In the letter he said, "First, Lanphier did not lead this mission. It was led by the undersigned. Secondly, no one knows who shot down the bomber in which Yamamoto was riding. Lanphier was leading the attack flight of 4 planes. When my wingman spotted Yamamoto's plane, he called in 2 bombers, which was correct. They were flying side by side, identical in every respect. As Lanphier and his flight made a pass at the bombers, they were intercepted by 6 Zeros who were escorting. They were forced to pull up, and the bombers headed for the treetops. In the next few seconds, the bombers were lost to view. Later, Lanphier and his wingman, Major Rex T. Barber, then a first lieutenant, after becoming separated from each other, each shot down a bomber in widely separated spots. Therefore, there was no way of knowing which bomber was the lead bomber, nor of knowing in which airplane Yamamoto was riding. I have read many accounts of this in the past, with Lanphier claiming credit completely, and I consider it an injustice to his wingman, Major Rex Barber, who just as likely destroyed the Japanese admiral, and to the other men in the flight who were all responsible in making the mission a success by carrying out to the letter the exact instructions given them the night before. It is my opinion that the record should be set straight and that some kind of public announcement be made to credit Barber with his share of this achievement, and to emphasize that it is just as likely that he made the termination as Lanphier. Mitchell received a cryptic, non-committal reply. The Army Air Forces, then in the throes of planning to detach itself from the Army and become a separate service under the Department of Defense, took no action. Meanwhile, Lanphier decided that there was no future for him in uniform and quickly separated from active duty as a lieutenant colonel in October 1945. He went to Boise, Idaho, where he became managing editor of the Idaho Daily Statesman, the state's largest newspaper, reportedly owned by a close friend of the Lanphier family. He joined the Idaho National Guard as senior air officer of the 190th Fighter Squadron. In February 1946, he was selected as third vice president of the newly formed Air Force Association. He was to serve until general elections could be held the following year. In announcing his selection, Air Force, the association's magazine, reported that he participated in more than 100 combat missions in the South Pacific. Among his outstanding exploits was the shooting down of the plane carrying Admiral Yamamoto. Lanphier became the first elected president of the association in 1947, and again the magazine credited him with Yamamoto's demise. In his inaugural address at the association's convention, he said he was going to visit every state that has a wing at least once, and I may be able to borrow a P-51 to swing it. He travelled extensively around the country, speaking about the virtues of American air power and making many political contacts. Sponsors always billed him as the man who shot down Yamamoto. An article in Air Force described the election and other activities of the convention, and again gave him credit for the elimination. Tom was in the flight of fighters assigned to intercept that trip, his personal mission, to take care of the admiral. Intelligence had reported the exact minute Yamamoto was due to arrive at Bougainville. The admiral was punctual. So was Tom. He dove in and got the admiral's bomber, and with it the man who was reported to have boasted that the Japanese would dictate peace terms in the White House. In the same pass, Lieutenant Rex Barber dove in and knocked off the second bomber in the Jap party. Tom and Barber were jumped by the Admiral S fighter escort of 6 Zeros, got 3 of the 6 in the getaway. In January 1949, Lanfier was given the Air Force Association's Exceptional Civilian Award for outstanding journalistic endeavour in support of air power and his dynamic leadership of the Air Force Association. The award was made by W. Stuart Symington, the first Secretary of the Air Force. In the ensuing months, Lanfier loudly and publicly advocated merging the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve Forces. He ran into fierce opposition on this and other national defence issues, not only from members of the 2 reserve components of the newly established Air Force, but from the active duty hierarchy and many members of Congress as well. Air Force historians released a 7-volume history of World War II in 1950, which was published by the University of Chicago Press. The account, obviously derived from the original official action report signed by Captain William Morrison and Lieutenant Joseph McGuigan, stated 2 hours and 9 minutes after takeoff at 7:25, as 16 P-38s flew in toward the coast of Bougainville, barely clearing the water. There ahead appeared the enemy, almost as if the entire affair had been prearranged by mutual consent. 2 Bettys turned to escape, while their 6-0 escorts tried in vain to cut off Lanfier's attack section. Lanfier exploded 1 fighter, then dived on 1 bomber, sending it flaming into the jungle, while Barber disintegrated the other Betty. Escape of the P-38s was doubtful, since now the advantage of altitude lay with the Zeros, but by hedge-hopping, skidding and side-slipping, the attackers pulled away under a heavy counter-attack. Only Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine failed to return from this flawlessly executed mission, which had cost the Japanese their highest-ranking officer, victim apparently of Captain Lanfier's guns and Major Mitchell's flawless timing of the flight. In the chapter notes, the historians said that the information was based on an interview with Captain Lanfier and a summary of enemy aircraft destroyed by Army fighter pilots in the Solomon area covering period from August 22, 1942 to June 30, 1943. Neither Mitchell, Barber, Holmes, nor any other survivor of the mission was interviewed. The chapter note also stated, much secrecy surrounded this exploit, since its success rested on U.S. ability to understand the Japanese codes. Not one of the original intelligence reports examined ever gave any indication that Yamamoto was involved. Some difficulty arises in fixing responsibility for shooting down the victim's plane. Both Barber and Lanfier destroyed a bomber, and so did Holmes over Moyler Point. But this last one fell in the water. Barber's disintegrated in the air at 5,000 to 6,000 feet, while Lanfier's crashed into the trees. A subsequent report by the Japanese stated that Yamamoto was found dead in his wrecked plane, which would indicate that it was Lanfier's work. When Rex Barber read this, he wrote to the Office of Air Force History saying that he did not intercept the bomber at 5,000 to 6,000 feet and explained the significance of this error. The bombers were at low level when he went after the lead bomber. He received a reply to his letter thanking him for his input and stating that the corrected information would be included in any revised edition of our Volume 4. Volume 4 has never been revised. Barber decided to remain in the Air Force and received a regular commission. Not a glory seeker, he quietly went about his subsequent Air Force assignments, all the time seething at Lanfier's claim. He had served in China as a squadron commander with the 14th Air Force after his tour on Guadalcanal and flew 28 combat missions there. He was shot down in enemy territory. Although seriously injured, he evaded capture. Barber continued to fly fighters after the war was over. He participated in initial test work with the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the Air Force's first jet fighter, and commanded the first squadron in the Air Force to be equipped with jet fighter aircraft. He also participated in the 1946 Bendix Trophy Race, the first time a jet aircraft competed. In 1950, Barber was sent to Korea on a special assignment during which he flew 3 combat missions. Subsequent assignments included duty with the Air Defense Command and as air attaché in Colombia and Ecuador. He retired as a full colonel in 1961 after 21 years of active duty. After Lanfier left office as Air Force Association's president, he was named to its board of directors. Still wanting to stay in the Washington limelight, he volunteered in 1949 to fly around the world on commercial airlines to dramatize and publicize the progress aviation had made in the 46 years since the Wright brothers' historic first flights at Kitty Hawk. The flight had potential news value because Lanfier vowed he was going to break the record for round-the-world passenger travel set in 1948 by Edward Egan, chairman of the New York State Boxing Commission. Egan's record was 6 days, 3 hours, 40 minutes. Lanfier left New York on December 2, 1949, and returned in 4 days, 23 hours, 50 minutes. After Lanfier returned to Washington, he told friends about his night arrival at Tokyo's International Airport. He also related this story later to one writer, and reportedly later included it in his unpublished memoirs. He said he was met there by a representative of the American embassy who told him there was a group of Japanese who wanted to see him. Lanfier left the plane and said he was greeted by Mrs. Isoroku Yamamoto. Lanfier said she spoke through an interpreter and presented him with a bouquet of flowers. Lanfier said she spoke quietly and seemingly without resentment as they exchanged pleasantries. She mentioned that her son was then a student at Harvard University and liked America. Lanfier was flustered by the meeting and mumbled his appreciation for the flowers. She smiled wanly and disappeared. Lanfier said he walked to the terminal where local newsmen confronted him with extensive questions about what he thought of Admiral Yamamoto and requested details about the shoot-down of their revered naval hero. He said he answered them candidly and then continued on his record-breaking flight. There is no verification for this story, other than Lanfier's statement to colleagues and a book writer. Its retelling, however, enabled him to restate and further his claim that he was the pilot who deserved full credit for Yamamoto's demise. The encounter received no press coverage, and the extensive story Lanfier wrote describing his trip for a January 1950 article in Air Force magazine carried no mention of the meeting. No evidence has been found confirming that the meeting with Mrs. Yamamoto actually took place. Lanfier left Idaho in late 1949 for Washington, where he had made many political contacts and where he thought his future lay. He had become an outspoken critic of the nation's military policies, and any time his name was mentioned, he was referred to as the man who had shot down Yamamoto. In 1950, he was appointed to the staff of Air Force Secretary W. Stuart Symington, with the title of Special Assistant. A historian on Symington's staff recalled that staff members resented Lanfier being hailed around the country as the man who shot down Yamamoto. This source added, "This alleged achievement vaulted Lanfier into a number of key assignments. No doubt Lanfier had a lot of ability, but there is also no doubt that his questionable claim to sole credit for the shoot-down did not hurt his advancement." Lanfier continued to serve with Symington when the latter was appointed chairman of the National Security Resources Board. In 1951, Lanfier moved to San Diego to become vice president of the Convair division of General Dynamics Corporation and continued to gain public attention for his vocal commentaries on military affairs. On January 26, 1960, syndicated columnist Joseph Alsop wrote an article that appeared in the Washington Post and other newspapers saying that he and Rex Barber had met in China in 1944, after Barber, then flying with Chennault's famous Flying Tigers, had been shot down by Japanese fighters but not captured. He had been too badly injured to walk, Alsop wrote. He had been carried several hundred miles on the backs of Chinese guerrillas. He had several hairbreadth escapes from Japanese patrols. According to Alsop, after a good many can pace of the local white mule, Barber allegedly told him, "The man who got the Admiral was Tom Lanfier. I was his wingman. He led the attack. We each got a bomber, but he took the first one, and the first one had Yamamoto on board. Alsop wrote there was a good reason for bringing up this snapshot of the forgotten past out of memories album. This same Tom Lanphier, whom the Major Barber talked about for much of the rest of that happy, long-ago evening, is again being talked about here in Washington. But this time Lanphier is being discussed in very different language by men on the highest level of the American government. Alsop stated that Lanphier was a center of attention in the nation's capital because he is a worried man, and because he has attacked the thing that worries him with the same devil-may-care, go-for-the-lead bomber determination that he showed when Yamamoto met his end. At the time, Lanphier, as a vice president of Convair, was in charge of the Atlas Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Program. Since he had served as a special assistant to Senator W. Stuart Symington when Symington became the first Secretary of the Air Force, Alsop said he was Symington's close friend. And in the last months, Symington and Lanphier, with Lanphier feverishly spurring Symington on, have desperately pressed for a cold, hard new look at the changes in the military balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. In a meeting with Symington and CIA Director Alan W. Dulles, Alsop reported that Lanphier all but broke up the party by declaring that his own manufacturing experience proved the dangerous over-optimism of the official estimates of Soviet missile output. Alsop pointed out that Lanphier has an obvious interest in bigger Atlas orders from the Air Force. Thus, a good many men on the higher governmental level are smugly saying that Tom Lanphier has just been selling a bill of goods with his furious, worried talk about the missile gap. Once more, Barber's anger mounted over Lanphier's renewed public claim for the Yamamoto shoot-down. He recalled having had a conversation with Alsop in China, but certainly did not give credit to Lanphier for the Yamamoto shoot-down. He immediately called Alsop's office. "I told his receptionist who I was," he recalled. "She put me on hold and returned shortly to say that Mr. Alsop could not talk to me then. I asked that he call me back. He never returned that call, or any of a number of follow-up calls I made during the following 2 weeks. Finally, the receptionist told me it was useless for me to continue calling, as Mr. Alsop had told her he was not in as far as I was concerned." In 1984, while preparing a manuscript for his memoirs, Lanphier wrote to Alsop requesting permission to quote from his 1960 column. Alsop gave permission and added, "But do you really want to, in view of your controversy with Barber? If the column is printed with its date, as it ought to be, any reader will be able to see that I was recalling an episode in China a good many years earlier than the date of the column. And China, moreover, is not the right context for the destruction of Yamamoto. Hence the astute reader will not, and indeed should not, take this column as evidence in the dispute between Barber and you." In addition to getting renewed public attention as the man who shot down Yamamoto, Lanphier continued to expound his views about the so-called missile gap. He appeared on the Today Show twice in early 1960, castigating the short-sightedness of the Eisenhower administration concerning the Soviet Union's growing missile capabilities. Barber's blood pressure rose every time he heard of Lanphier's invoking the Yamamoto shoot-down to further his own publicity-grabbing interests. In June 1960, Barber was Wing Material Officer for the 363D Fighter Wing at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, South Carolina. The Air Force asked his wing to conduct cold-weather tests on the F-100 jet fighter in the climatic hangar at Keglin Air Force Base, Florida. His duties required him to monitor these tests. Manx aircraft manufacturers and high-level government officials were invited to look at the results of the tests under simulated Arctic conditions pertaining to oils, lubricants, guns, armament, etc. As the visitors, including Lanphier, arrived for an official briefing, Barber was the official greeter. He talked with Lanphier and asked him why he had been on the Today Show a few weeks before attacking President Eisenhower and his administration's defense policies. Barber knew Lanphier was a Republican and was surprised that Lanphier would criticize the president so stridently on national television. Lanphier took Barber aside. "What you don't understand," Lanphier said disdainfully, "is what's going on in Washington these days. Senator Symington and I are very close. We are going to the Democratic National Convention this summer. We believe the convention will be deadlocked between Senators Johnson and Kennedy, and the delegates will finally have to settle for a dark horse candidate. Senator Symington is the one most likely to be nominated as a compromise candidate for the presidency. Symington is going to take the unprecedented step of naming me his vice presidential running mate. By doing this, we can split the Republican vote and win." Barber could not believe what he was hearing. Lanphier had always been clever, articulate, and fast-thinking. He had such a convincing way about him that Barber didn't know how to respond. On the way back to his base, Barber recalled those days in the South Pacific when he and Lanphier had been close friends and had flown on many missions together, each helping the other out of scrapes against enemy planes. He remembered Tom saying that he had great ambitions for a political career after the war, and that he was going to establish an outstanding war record so he would become nationally known. Barber also remembered that Lanphier had told him not to worry about the details in the intelligence report on the Yamamoto mission because he had written it. Lanphier also said he had helped write the citations for the Medal of Honor for Mitchell and the 4 shooters. The brief 1960 encounter with Lanphier suddenly brought the controversy over the shootdown into sharp focus once again for Barber. Lanphier had been deadly serious about coming out of the war a hero whose name would be so well known that he would be able to travel in the highest government and industry circles and be listened to because of his fame as the man who shot down Yamamoto. It all fitted together and summed up the personality of a man who seemed to be driven by a deep psychological need for admiration, fame, and power. W. Stuart Symington had served as the first Secretary of the Air Force from September 1947 until he resigned in 1951 in protest over cuts in the Air Force budget. He won election to the Senate in 1952 and in 1960 was unsuccessful in his bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. After John F. Kennedy was nominated, Symington was mentioned prominently as a vice presidential candidate before that offer went to Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. The name of Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr. never surfaced. The convention was not deadlocked, so Symington had no opportunity to name a vice president. In 1967, an unnamed Air Force officer investigated the original 1943 report signed by Captain William Morrison and Lieutenant Joseph McGuigan and wrote, "The report is enough to make one weep. It reads like a fiction tale, and the facts appear to be intertwined like Medusa's locks." In 1973, Kit C. Carter and Robert Muller, Air Force historians, prepared a combat chronology for the Air University and the Office of Air Force History. Under the chronology of events for 1943, they summarized the Yamamoto mission for April 18, 1943, and tersely concluded, "In the air battle, Captain Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber shoot down the BMR carrying Yamamoto." The Air Force had thus concluded in a review of all victory credits of World War II pilots that Lanphier and Barber should share credit for the Yamamoto shootdown. In May 1983, at a reunion of the American Fighter Aces Association, Lanphier learned, apparently for the first time, that the Air Force had officially split the victory credits between him and Barber. It was the first time that Mitchell, Barber and Lanphier had been together since World War II. The story about the division of credit by Barrett Tillman ran in the Arizona Republic. "When Tom saw the article, he came unglued," Tillman told the author. "He was irate and took offense, saying that his integrity had been assailed. The official nature of USAF Study 85, the overall revision of USAAF credits did little or nothing to alleviate Tom's rancor." On April 11, 1985, Lanphier was invited to appear at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., to talk about his life and especially the Yamamoto shootdown. It was the first of at least 3 talks he planned to give during that spring. The talk at the Smithsonian was one of a continuing series of presentations by men and women in aviation who have participated in aerospace events of historical interest. The lectures are always well attended by aerospace enthusiasts. Introduced as the man who had caused the Admiral's demise, Lanphier proved to be an engaging speaker. He regaled the audience with tales of his life, illustrated with slides. He told of his early years as the son of a man who had made his own contributions to the history of the Air Force. His father was a West Point graduate, a World War I fighter pilot, and former commanding officer of the 1st Pursuit Squadron. The elder Lanphier's friends included the famous military aviation names of the day: Billy Mitchell, Charles Lindbergh, Jimmy Doolittle, Hap, Arnold, Ira Eaker, Carl Sparts, famous racing pilots, and others. Born in 1915, Tom, one of 3 sons, had grown up at various Army Air Corps bases where his father was assigned. The Yamamoto shoot-down was the main thrust of Lanfier's talk. He said his brother Charles had told a fellow prisoner the night before he died in prison camp, "My brother is the guy who shot down Yamamoto." Lanfier did not say how he learned about his brother's deathbed revelation. Lanfier, well aware that the audience knew of the continuing controversy about the shoot-down, called Barber one of the most decorated, one of the most aggressive, effective fighter pilots in the Solomon Islands. He added quickly, "He got the staff bomber on the Yamamoto mission. I got the lead bomber." Lanfier claimed that Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, when told of the Yamamoto itinerary, called General Hap Arnold to ask if they should go after the Admiral. Lanfier said Arnold replied, "Yes, eliminate the idiot." Lanfier then stated that when President Roosevelt was contacted by Captain Zacharias, a naval aide, and told of Yamamoto's planned trip, President Roosevelt said, "If Knox doesn't approve it by noon tomorrow, tell him I told him to do it." Again, Lanfier offered no substantiation for his unusual statements. Lanfier next quoted the alleged message that has never been found: "Squadrons of P-39s and P-38s must at all costs reach and destroy. President attaches extreme importance this operation. Knox." Lanfier gave much praise to Marine Major General John Condon, who was in the audience. Condon had been a major on Admiral Mitchell's staff at the time of the mission, and Lanfier credited him with the detailed flight plan for the successful interception. He gave no credit to Mitchell for planning the mission. Lanfier then described the mission from the moment the 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zeros were spotted. At this point, I started to turn parallel to climb and firewalled it. For a couple of minutes, they didn't see us down there. Mitchell was on his way up to his altitude. At this point, I also lost my number 3 and 4 men. They couldn't get their wing tanks off, so they went off down the coast. So it was just Barber and myself against the 6 Zeros when we got up parallel with them. When they saw us, they dropped their belly tanks and dove on us. 3 of them came between me and the lead bomber. The lead bomber dived down and away. The wing bomber came over and at us toward the sea, with the staff in it. I pulled up into the lead fighter of the first 3 because I couldn't get at the bomber there in between them. He caught fire and went under me, and I went between the other 2. I flipped over on my back and looked down, and there was this bomber back down on the treetops heading again toward Kahili and Balal. I then dove down from an altitude wherever I was, about 6,000 feet, to get ahead of him and cut across on him. I got going so fast, I ran on him for about 2 minutes, maybe 10 miles at some 300 miles an hour. I turned into him and leveled out. I had dropped my flaps to slow down. I figured I was at the point to check my guns. I checked my guns. They had worked up above, but I squeezed. I cleared the guns, and when I did, the right engine of the lead bomber started to burn. I was at about 70 degrees, which is an impossible angle to hit anything. I kept on a curve of pursuit, and his right wing began to burn also. Just as I went behind him, with his cannon shooting out the rear end, the wing came off and he belly-whopped into the jungle, and I went on past. I came down through a cloud of dust, and the Zeros were making a dust storm back over here where he was burning. I got out safely. Barber, meanwhile, followed the wing bomber out here toward the ocean and shot it down in the water. Lanfier showed photos of the Betty's wreckage in the jungle and said, "Yamamoto was obviously sitting in the cabin facing backwards, strapped in his seat when he was thrown out. He had his left hand on his sword. When I terminated him, I hated him," Lanfier continued. "He was the only personalized elimination I've been involved in. Naturally, I became interested and learned a great deal about him. He was a gambler, a poet, a calligrapher, master strategist, planner, courageous man, cared for his men, didn't give a damn for his superiors, the ones who didn't agree with him. Altogether a truly great man whom I admire and respect, and if I had the chance to terminate him again, I would do it in a minute." Lanfier showed a slide of the page from the 1943 issue of Time, which says I am a hero. He said that Time knew full well it was jeopardizing the magic system by running the article. Lanfier's talk created no press coverage. During the spring of 1985, he formed a corporation called the Flight Group to produce a series for television on the history of flight. He solicited the support of a number of persons he believed could provide financial backing, research the archives, and write the scripts. He asked the author to assist by writing and researching for the series, and insisted that one of the episodes must be on the Yamamoto shoot-down because it's one of the epic missions of all time. The only work ever completed was an interview he partially conducted with General James H. Jimmy Doolittle using questions furnished by the author. He also had a segment filmed on himself describing how he shot the Admiral down. The filmed interview with Doolittle was eventually included in a 1989 PBS television special entitled Jimmy Doolittle, an American Hero. The interview about the Yamamoto mission was included in a videotape entitled Wings Over Water. Both were produced by Varied Directions, Inc., Camden,